Welcome back to Propaganda by the Seed. This week we'll be talking about Peecycling with the Rich Earth Institute. But before we get into that, let's hear from our friends at the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcast wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero Network.
Arthur and Tatiana from the Rich Earth Institute, welcome to Propaganda by the Seed. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get in touch with you all for a while for this interview, and I finally had the flexibility in my schedule to make some new episodes happen. So I'm thrilled to be having this conversation, and I thought we could start off with, what does the Rich Earth Institute do, and how did you all get started?
Great. I'll let Arthur take that.
All right, I'll take that one. So, well, I guess for transparency's sake, I was not around when it started, but we started back in 2012, and it was kind of a collaboration between Abe Noe Hayes and Kim Nace, and they Abe had been building composting toilets, and Kim had been working in education, and they kind of came together at a point in time. They both wanted to do a project that was around sanitation, and they found they felt like there was some good work to be done looking at urine as a fertilizer, and so that first, at the very beginning, they kind of very grassroots started. They kind of got this little community of people together to try to collect their urine, and they collected about 600 gallons that first summer, all at Kim's house in her garage, and they worked through some offices at the Vermont State Department of Environmental Conservation, and kind of got permission to do this, to do a kind of a hay yield study, looking at using urine versus other fertilizers, and that was kind of how it all got started. So in terms of what we do now, we run a community scale urine recycling program. We've gone from that 600 gallons that first year to over 13,000 gallons collected and processed and applied last year.
Very impressive.
And then we also do a kind of wide variety of education and outreach activities around the use of urine, and in some ways more widely human waste as a resource. And we do also basic research. So we work with a number of university partners doing a kind of a variety of kinds of research projects, often in the agricultural realm, but not always. And then in addition to our kind of ongoing program of urine collecting, I would say our kind of implementation program, we think of it as kind of a kind of community laboratory of sorts, in terms of like using that program to try out new technologies, new processes, and try to move the state of human waste resource, human waste as a resource forward in the U.S. and globally.
Yeah, awesome. I don't know of many people working on this particular issue, so I think Rich Earth Institute is kind of the go-to. Do you have international partners? Are there other people working on this in other parts of the world?
Yeah, there's people all over the world who are working on this issue, and in a lot of ways are in many ways are further along in other parts of the world.
Makes sense.
We have we run a annual summit kind of conference that used to be mostly an in-person thing, but during the pandemic it became a online and now hybrid event. Um, and we have people coming to it from almost every continent. Um, yeah, as far away as Australia, various countries in Africa. There's lots of people in Europe working on this. Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, France, and there's also a growing interest in the U.S. as well in terms of people across the country who are working on this kind of stuff.
Excellent. Why, just kind of big picture, why is pea cycling or use of urine as a fertilizer important?
You
Um,
want to take that one, Tatiana?
I'll start and you can add to it.
Okay.
But one thing I wanted to say is that, as your listeners, I'm sure, know, human waste and human waste used to be connected to agriculture in an ecological system. Historically, in any kind of ecological system, the waste from all the animals is recycled in the same ecosystem that it's a part of, and it's got separated historically in the name of modern sanitation. It was one of the reasons, separating our human waste from our food. But what we're trying to do is really reconnect that, because there's a lot of negative consequences that have stemmed from that separation. In particular, the fact that our human waste now goes into the larger waste stream and gets mixed with all kinds of toxins from industry and things like that, and then we have to separate it back out again, and that's very expensive at the waste treatment plants, and a lot of it doesn't get separated out. It ends up going into our waterways. So that's the main reason. I mean, you know waste treatment plants have to spend a lot of energy and money trying to keep the nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are key components of urine, out of waterways where they are pollutants. And then figure out what to do with them or how to get them back to be used as fertilizers. So we're trying to go back one step and not have the waste go into the waste stream and use it directly and recover those nutrients.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, I think I often kind of talk about it as like a little bit of a three-legged stool, or kind of like three kind of legs of reasons that people I think sometimes get on board with this idea. One is the water quality, water pollution issue, nutrient pollution. So lots of our coastal waterways, lakes, etc., in the U.S. are dealing with nutrient overloading problems, which can have effects on recreation, um, on aquatic health, et cetera, et cetera. And also more and more in different places, there's starting to be more regulations about nutrient runoff and nutrient loading. So that's kind of one. That's kind of, in some ways, that's one of the biggest ones. Then another one is like local fertilizer production, being able to produce kind of the fertility that we need in our own whatever it is, small community or larger region. And then the third one is water conservation, because we use a lot of water to convey our pee, and most of our trips to the bathroom are for peeing only. So there's a big potential water savings in these kinds of systems. So depending on where you are geographically, one of those or two of those might be bigger drivers than other ones. But I think they're all reasons that can lead to this idea making sense in a place.
Yeah, all good reasons, and I'm certainly 100% sold on this idea. Um, what, if any, are the risks of pea cycling?
Actually, just before we get to the risks, I wanted to mention that this is kind of like a pet thing of mine, but I like to emphasize that the urine, we often talk about the NPK of urine, and we'll get to that momentarily, I think, but it's a high nitrogen fertilizer. but it also contains secondary nutrients, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, and a whole range of micronutrients. So,
Excellent.
we're looking for like a holistic fertilizer one because because we eat um, as omnivores, we eat so many different kinds of foods. That's why our waste contains all of these different nutrients. So that's just something people often talk about NPK, but I like to mention that it also has all these other nutrients.
Perfect.
There's risks, potential risks. And Arthur will, I'm sure, add to this, but my role is I'm the social research director. So my role is in our research grants to do a lot of talking with farmers and gardeners and other kinds of people about what their concerns are and how they perceive the risks. Risks are a lot of times in the perception of it. But the most commonly expressed concerns have to do with contaminants in the urine because we eat pharmaceuticals. That's what people bring up most often. And so there are various treatment or mitigation strategies we can use to address that. And we could talk more about that in a minute. There other risks could be, well, pathogens, and that's why we use sanitized urine, although the pathogen content is very low. Some people think that urine is completely sterile, which it's not 100% sterile, but it's close. So we use sanitized urine for that reason. And in terms of feces, that's a bigger problem. We want to make sure that there's no cross-contamination between the urine and the feces. So, and Arthur will talk more about the kind of toilets that can be used to collect urine, but that's a concern. That could be a concern, cross-contamination with feces. So, you want to say more, Arthur, about potential?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say, so we did, I mean, pharmaceuticals come up pretty regularly in terms of people's concerns. We did a big study a number of years ago with the University of Michigan and the University at Buffalo, and we were looking at pharmaceutical at the risk of pharmaceuticals, and we used a like a spiked urine. Actually, the urine that we collected didn't have high enough pharmaceutical load for what we were kind of trying to do a semi worst case scenario based on the literature of what pharmaceutical load might be in the urine. So we kind of spiked the urine to be at those levels for the compounds we were looking for, and and we were growing lettuce and carrots. So kind of trying to, both food crops where, one is we're directly eating the leaf, one is we're directly eating the root, a little closer to the, what the plant is uptaking than say maybe a fruit or something. So basically, I mean, we found, so unsurprisingly, like caffeine was like far and away the most abundant concentrated pharmaceutical we were looking at, because lots of people drink caffeine. And so we found that it would take about eating a pound of lettuce every day for about 2,000 years to get the caffeine that you'd find in a cup of coffee. And so that, I think that kind of just illustrates that we did find, using really fancy tools in a university research lab, we can identify those compounds in plant tissues, but they are really, very very dilute. And I think it also brings up a question in my mind about what is the, kind of like, if we just take urine out of the conversation, what are the kinds of contamination issues that we're looking at right now? And, for better or for worse, I mean, I would say for worse, we don't live in a world that is pristine of compounds like pharmaceuticals. And I mean, right now, a big thing that we're talking about is PFAS. You in Maine, you've had a lot of PFAS-related upheavals in the agricultural community, and
Yeah, for sure.
and that's really huge. And so we've been starting to do some calculations about kind of like what like based on what we've seen with urine, how much is urine increasing or decreasing the existing risk? And what we find generally is that urine is not um, is a lot less of a addition of some of these compounds than existing practices, even without biosolids. Even if we're not looking at biosolids, even potentially like just rainwater. Um, and I mean, that is like that's an issue, but it is an issue that we're all dealing with, that we have to deal with this stuff. And I don't think that there's that the potential very small amount of addition of maybe some of these things is it doesn't add up to what's already happening, and we have to deal with these things anyway. I think especially with PFAS, I think we need to stop making them and putting them out into the environment.
That would be
Um,
nice. Yeah.
but I think the what we're seeing with urine and the research we've been doing so far, especially with PFAS, is that urine is not a big contributor.
Excellent. Yeah. So it seems like there's minute amounts of pharmaceuticals being bioaccumulated, but it's so small that it is insignificant.
Yeah,
Well,
and with PFAS, I think most of the PFAS testing that we've done has shown non-detect, especially for the long chain PFAS compounds, um, um, and we it sometimes it's hard to tell. We have found some short chain PFAS compounds. I think we suspect that most of those are cross contaminated from containers and stuff,
Yeah.
not actually the urine itself, based on like repeat testing and not finding those. Um, anyway, it is definitely it's an emerging issue that we're dealing with. We also have a research project that we're doing right now in collaboration with Cornell. Tatiana can talk a little bit more about this. That's looking at ways to mitigate the PFAS risk specifically, potentially with pyrolysis.
Cool.
I wanted to say something else too that's sort of interesting. We have a community science survey that's part of our what we call our urine my garden program, which is um,
I
our
love it.
program addresses gardeners. I think I sent you, and your listeners can find it on our website, but we have a guide to using urine in home gardens. But linked to that is a community science survey where we ask people to report their own experiences using urine in their own gardens. And we've attached to that sort of story collector. We're sort of collecting people's stories about their experiences, and how this is affecting them in different ways. And it's interesting, earlier, I've been involved with Rich Earth since I think it was something like 2013 when I joined the board, before I became a staff member. And during that time when I was on the board, we did some research with the people who provide urine to our community collection program that Arthur was talking about. We did some research with them, focus groups and interviews about how it affected them personally to be doing this. And one of the things that people often said was that, as they do it and they become more sort of aware of the fact that everything you put in your body might potentially go in your garden, so people start becoming more, thinking more about what am I consuming, and maybe being a little more conscious about that, and maybe more concerned on a societal or collective level too about, as Arthur was saying, like, how could we stop these things from being produced in the first place, because that's really the problem, like PFAS. Oops, now my phone is ringing. Yeah, so that's just something I wanted to say. And as far as sorry, my phone will stop ringing in a minute, but as far as the study, yeah, with the pharmaceuticals, we did the study that Arthur mentioned, looking at uptake in crop tissue. We're still kind of investigating any effects of these kinds of amendments on soil health, including biosolids. We're looking at this study that we're currently involved with is looking at urine. It's also looking at biochar made from both biomass. I think we're using wood chips, biochar made from wood chips, and then a biochar made from biosolids. And we're doing all these combinations of these amendments and compost to see any potential effects on soil health. And then that's including microbial communities, whether there's any changes in the diversity or richness of the microbial communities, because that's something that in our research farmers frequently ask about, and gardeners as well. It's like, well, how might this affect soil health? And what's the fate of these pharmaceuticals? We're not actually looking at the fate of the pharmaceuticals, but we're looking at soil health indicators, and we're looking at the potential changes in microbial communities as indicators of any effects these things might have, not just the pharmaceuticals, but the amendments themselves on soil health.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing the results of those studies.
Yeah,
That sounds fascinating.
years down the road, as long as our funding remains intact.
Oof, yeah, that's a whole
These are
whole nother
ongoing studies.
nightmare for
Yeah,
for
exactly.
A
lots of scientists
whole
at the
other
moment.
situation.
All right, so let's say the listener is convinced of the idea of Peecycling, that it is the way to go, and it's free fertilizer, and it's keeping nutrients in the soil where they should be and out of the waterways. How can someone implement this on a sort of home scale?
Yeah. So well, among other things, we have a resource for people like that. We have kind of a home use guide for using urine as a fertilizer, which is available for free on our website.
Excellent. And I'll link to that in the show notes so people can
Yeah,
find
that's
it
great.
easily.
And then we also do run specifically, I mean, I won't go into all the details, and I'm not usually the one who does these, but our colleague Julia runs a webinar called You're in My Garden. So if listeners are interested in kind of participating in a webinar where you can ask live questions, etc., that's a thing that happens on a regular basis. I don't know when the next one is, but um, um, but anyway, I guess the long and short of it is it's a very usable thing to incorporate into your own home gardening practice. At the Rich Earth Institute, we sanitize our urine because we are collecting from a wide array of community sources, and we don't know the contamination potential of the urine before it gets to us, et cetera, et cetera. But there are guidelines from the World Health Organization about using urine that has not been sanitized for your own home garden. And I believe that is linked in or at least discussed in the home use guide. So if people are kind of worried about that step, there are kind of health guidelines that can help kind of answer some of those questions.
Cool.
And yeah, I mean, I think the I think that one of the main things to know about urine as a fertilizer is that it is in some ways the form of the nitrogen is I mean, it comes out of your body as urea, and then it transforms fairly quickly into ammonium. Um, and so it's in a very like readily available form. So you want to apply urine when the plants are actively growing. And it does, as Tatiana said, it has lots of other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, lots of other secondary micronutrients, but it is primarily a nitrogen fertilizer. And so using it to meet the nitrogen needs of your plants is probably probably the best way to use it. And so nitrogen is primarily used for for green growth. foliar and stem growth. So using it at a time when your plants are, you know,
And
going
in
going in
addition,
for that kind of growth is the right call.
and in addition to the timing, we tend to recommend using it for plants that have high nitrogen needs. So
Right.
those would be like tomatoes, corn, I'm sure your listeners know, um, or can find out, which plants have the higher nitrogen needs. But we've also found from this community science survey that it seems to be quite effective on a range of other crops. Some things that I wouldn't have expected, like peppers and eggplants. I've always heard that you shouldn't use too much nitrogen. You get too much leaf and not enough fruit and whatever. But people are using it and finding that and we use it in our little demonstration garden at the institute, and we also found it was super with peppers and eggplants. So I'm not really sure about that. We wouldn't recommend using it on something like beans or legumes, which are nitrogen fixing plants, because they already
Right.
have enough nitrogen. And if you give them more, not only will it produce a lot of leafy growth, but it could cause your nitrogen fixing bacteria to kind of leave the scene because they're not really needed by the plant. And
Interesting.
yeah, and then later that could end up being a problem for your plant. So yeah, and generally speaking, but all of this, because it hasn't been practiced widely in our society for recently, we're really interested in collecting people's experiences and stories so we can better understand how it's working with different crops.
And
Excellent.
the last thing I'd say also is that we generally try to apply to wet soil.
Mhm.
So you don't necessarily need to dilute it. I mean, I think that is a way to kind of essentially be applying it to wet soil. But uh, dilution isn't necessarily necessary, although I think a lot of people do it, and I think that is totally effective. But you wouldn't want to apply undiluted urine to super dry soil because you'll get a lot more. You'll lose more of your ammonia to the air. So.
Interesting. It's a good tip. So you're collecting the urine, and what does storage look like on a home scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think that can look like a lot of things depending on how much you're trying to use. I think if you're just trying to collect, if you have a small kind of cottage garden and you're just want to kind of experiment with that. We do we also, I mean, just a little plug, we sell these little 5 gallon and 2.5 gallon urine collectors. Um, but you can also DIY something that you have around, and you want to store your pee in. But we kind of say generally, I'm trying to let me pull it up, see if I can find it in a moment. But you don't, like, for a small garden, you don't need that much pee, so you don't need to store that much. If you were maybe trying to, like, also fertilize, a larger lawn, or an area of hay field or something like that. Um, you probably need more. We apply hay. We apply to hay at a rate of about 1,000 gallons per acre. You can kind of do a lot of different kinds of storage. I would recommend having it be a closed container. You know,
Yeah.
you'll
So
you'll have
airtight,
a
whatever sort of
small
plastic
airtight.
container is handy
Yeah,
and scaled to whatever scale you're trying to work
yeah.
with.
The other thing is that is talked about in the WHO guidelines. But if you store urine, when it converts from urea to ammonia, it raises the pH, which also does act as a sanitization process. And so, if there are some guidelines in there, I don't have them off the top of my head, but you store it for a certain amount of time, then it basically achieves the same degree of sanitization as our heat pasteurization process.
Excellent. So you're gaining a benefit in sanitation from storage.
Mhm.
Um, what about, are you losing, as long as you've got it in an airtight container, are you losing any nutrients, gaining
No,
anything? It's just kind of, it's
holding
stable
pattern.
enough that you can
You
store
get
it.
some, you can get some precipitation out of some of the minerals, and
Primarily phosphorus.
phosphorus primarily, and you end up with like a scaly stuff along the sides of your container. And that can be mitigated somewhat by adding vinegar, which can also reduce the ammonia volatilization or the smell that's associated
Right.
with.
Although that's a temporary thing. So I think if you're going to be storing it for a long period of time, then the sanitization effect is the transformation from urea to ammonia. So
Mm.
um,
Right. That's true.
that's kind of more if you're kind of going to be using it,
Right,
peeing it and using it quick. Um,
right. But even if you get this scale, if you're using it for your home garden, you can still use it, and that's still the nutrients are still there. The phosphorus is there.
Yeah, you
Um,
just want to kind of reincorporate that
yeah,
solid material
exactly.
into your
Exactly.
fertilizer.
right.
Exactly.
Just as I did find this yeah, in our guide here, we kind of estimate for the average like type of amount of nitrogen that you would need for like kind of an average mixed vegetable garden. For a 10 by 10 garden plot, you would generally be looking at needing only about 3.5 to 5.5 gallons of urine over the entire growing season,
Oh, wow.
nit nitrogen wise. So
Yeah.
unless you have a really, really big garden or a farm, you are probably producing more urine than you need fertility wise. So I think that's just like a good gauge for people as they're kind of planning how they might use it. Which
That's
Yeah.
also,
that's great
I mean, that
information.
makes sense also, because as nutrients cycle, if we're eating more than like if we're buying in food to eat and not just eating food that we are growing, um, which is the case, I think, for at least most Americans. Um, we are, we're bringing in nutrients to our house, to our, living situation, and so um, we're then, excreting those nutrients, and we don't need, if we were eating all of the nutrients, if we were eating all of our nutrients from our own land, then having them all go back, I don't know. There's a cyclical nature to that. That if we're importing a lot of nutrients in the form of food to our homes and gardens, then we're probably producing more in our
So
excreta than we
ideally,
use
the
the amount of food that we're producing.
yeah. So ideally, that excess urine that you don't use for your own garden should go back to um, go to the farms that produce your food. That would be ideal. And we learned at our recent summit that we had about a project in France that I thought had a really interesting model, where it was a
Oh yeah.
seed model where they were actually they had this whole integrated system where they were like, people, when they would go to pick up their CSA boxes, they would also contribute their urine, and then the same vehicle that delivered the boxes would take the urine and bring it back, process it and bring it back to the farm. And it was all, it was
Yeah,
all
I love that. That's
It was very
brilliant.
cool. It's very cool.
very inspiring to see that.
An idea for a CSA somewhere out there.
Yeah, incredible. Well, I hope more people can implement that.
Yeah, if you have this excess, though, there are a lot of things you could do with it. As Arthur mentioned, you could use it on your lawn. You could use it for fruit crops and berry crops, and that's something that we're also kind of exploring. We recently did a project with farmers that were growing nut trees, a nut tree nursery. They were using it on their nursery crops, and you could also, use it on your fruit tree crops, or you could, scatter it in the woods. Another thing that people, in our culture do is they gather up their leaves and take it to a landfill, instead of just leaving their leaves where they fall. And it's the same thing. You're sort of removing the nutrients from where they should be. So
Mm,
like turning some of those nutrients in the form of your urine kind of distributed on the leaves would probably be something you could do.
yeah.
Um,
How about in compost? Is that a good place to sort of bank excess urine?
Well, we did studies with urine in leaf compost with really good success early on, and that's on our website. If people go to the research section, look at the agricultural research. That was one of our early projects. Um, I do it personally. I do put my urine on the compost. I think there's some concerns that you could be putting, too much or more than your compost needs because you do produce so much excess, and that amount of nitrogen could potentially be harmful to some of the microorganisms, but that's not something we've actually studied yet. So I think
So,
more research is kind of needed on that
so it's
front.
potentially useful, but you should take that into consideration when building the pile and maybe
You
add
want
a
to
little
make
extra
sure that you
carbon.
have right that you have a high carbon ratio. Exactly. You wouldn't want to use it if your compost was highly green materials or high nitrogen materials like lawn clippings and things like that. You'd end up with a mess. But
Gotcha.
I don't know, Arthur, if you want to add too.
No, that covers that.
Great. So let's move on to a little bit larger scale. If, let's say, you're not a home gardener, but you'd like to participate in pea cycling, or you're a small farmer and would like to benefit from capturing nutrients from other people. How has that worked for you in Vermont?
Yeah, so our community scale program works in a couple ways. So we, on the collection side, we have a lot of people, probably about 200 folks in the Brattleboro, Vermont area who collect, I guess I'll say informally, meaning that they don't have like a plumbed toilet or a, kind of official, you know, they're kind of going out of their way to some degree collect their pee, mostly in our portable urine collector devices that we make, and they bring those containers, which are either 5 gallon jugs or 2.5 gallon jugs, to one of two depots that we have that are part of our permit, and the depot has a a self-service pump out station, and that fills up a large tank, and then we come and we pump that tank out. We bring it back to our main facility, and then we pasteurize it. We also have people who collect using urine diverting toilets that have on-site permits through the state to have urine collection systems at their house, and we also and some not just residences but also some public facilities as well. We had one at a brewery. We have one at a kind of a event venue that has waterless urinals in the men's room, um, and and so we go to all those locations and we pump out those tanks and we again bring it back to our facility where it gets pasteurized. Then we pasteurize it, and we once it's pasteurized during the growing season, we bring it to farms and we mostly use it on hay. We have a lot of hay crop around here, um, and grass is very nitrogen hungry, so that's kind of a great match in terms of cropping for urine. We have also collaborated with a number of other kinds of farmers, though, including corn growers, various other vegetables, hemp, cut flowers, um, and I think there's definitely interest in using it on non-food crops, often just because of the you know some of the kind of perception issues. But we are permitted to use it on any crops. The thing, I guess so that's kind of what it looks like for us. We've used it generally. I mean, we have generally not been selling the fertilizer to farmers. But I think that as we continue on down this path, that that could be somewhat of a way that we make some continue to keep the project going. Although I don't think that we're in the soon kind of place. I don't think that the economics work that we would be making like that we'd be making all of the money necessary to do the whole process from selling fertilizer. I think that the way this would probably work economically down the line is that a lot of the funding would come from the pollution prevention side of the equation. Um, so that's kind of the way it works for us. Some other places, there are um, other models that have been done in Europe. There's a company called Vuna that they have a kind of big processing. It's a biological processing system, and so their product they're turning a lot of the nitrogen into nitrate. So it's about half ammonium, half nitrate in their end product, and they go into big buildings and they get the buildings sanitation systems to all run, and it's kind of like a centralized treatment system in the basement of the building. So they have done some kind of office building kinds of things. They have a system at the European Space Agency in Paris. And then they sell and then it's also a concentrated fertilizer. Much more concentrated than the straight urine. And so they sell it at um, kind of like garden farm stores, kind of the way you'd buy Neptune's Harvest fish fertilizer or something like that,
Very
as like,
interesting.
kind of like, here, buy this fertilizer for your, houseplants and garden plants and stuff. So that's kind of another model that's out there that is being utilized. I think there's also a movement in some places to move towards a dry fertilizer, um, um, that maybe could be used more compatibly with existing farm equipment. Um, at least for certain kinds of uses. There's also, we've done a lot of work on different application methods. Our hay, well, I actually kind of see a picture here of uh, an early version of our hay applicator. Um, it's basically a tank that is pulled behind a tractor with a boom and gravity feed. So that's still mostly what we use for applying to hay. But we've also done um, work using drip irrigation, for crops that are watered using drip irrigation, and injecting urine into those systems. We've been working with a sweet corn farmer who uses it. We've been developing a system to apply urine during the time when he's cultivating the corn. So he's already kind of out there doing passes in the tractor, and it's when the corn is about the right timing for a big dose of nitrogen. So that's been really interesting, and we've been working on a system currently with a funding through this USDA SARE program to kind of develop this system, and we're going to be trialing the next iteration of it this summer.
Cool.
So there's a lot of different kind of ways in which that can look. To get back to your question about what does it look like on a community scale, I think if someone was kind of interested in starting a community scale project in another community, we have been working with some other communities, primarily down in the Cape Cod region of Massachusetts. There's a lot of interest because of a lot of their coastal nutrient loading issues. There's been a lot of interest in some of the kind of adjacent communities to our community. So, like in Western Massachusetts, there's been quite a lot of interest. There's also a big farming community down there. Anyway, I would say reach out to us, and we have some resources that we can share about kind of some of the considerations and steps that would be useful in kind of trying to get something like this off the ground.
There's also you're probably maybe going to get into this a little more in a minute, but other considerations include the Farm Safety Modernization Act. Of course, now I don't know what with the FDA firings that just happened. I don't know what's going to happen to some of these things, some of these people. But right now, Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
chaos is going to
chaos is
happen.
happening. But
Yeah.
the Food Modernization Safety Act, or Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, has some provisions that relate to this to a degree. In that we've tried to outline this. As another resource we have is our farm guide. Um, we talked about the guide to using urine in the garden. We also have a guide to using urine on farms that we just recently produced. So, and that will be iterated or be revised as we get more information. But we tried to put in there what we could understand as best as we could about how the Food Safety Modernization Act produce rule applies to the use of urine on farms. But basically, it applies to um, the produce rule only applies to crops that are eaten
Raw,
raw.
generally eaten raw.
Yeah, generally eaten raw. So it doesn't apply to crops that need to be cooked, like a butternut squash or something. It wouldn't apply to them. Um, and then it doesn't apply to farms that gross under a certain limit, which was the last time we checked about $30,000. So if you gross less than $30,000, that it doesn't apply to you.
And all of this stuff is gone into in more detail in the
In the farm guide.
farmer guide.
People
So I think we don't need to get into every detail
Yeah,
Yeah.
here.
excellent. But thanks for pointing that out. And yeah, I'll definitely link to the farm guide as well. And I guess for my next question, I want to ask you to imagine a massive societal scale, like
Yeah.
what could happen with Peecycling if people thought it was important, or potentially like prices of fertilizer went up significantly and made it more economically viable. What are some large scale changes that could happen to make this um, be used on a broader scale?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's fun to imagine. For me, anyway, unless you want to go first, Tatiana, I have.
No, you can go first.
Okay. So I think it could look like a lot of different things, but I think in places that are more rural, I think that, these kind of community scale systems, I think definitely play a role. Um, you know, um, I think that I think that taking advantage of existing industries that are like septic haulers and portable toilet companies, to do to be the industries that are doing the pump outs and things like that, from homes and businesses and public locations, that maybe have installed infrastructure. I think that, as far as the collection goes, I think that wall urinals are a great way to start. It obviously doesn't collect urine from everybody, but I think that because they're already so much part of the way the modern sanitation way of going to the bathroom, and they're not like a new piece of infrastructure. I think it's a great way to start. I think it gets a lot of the back end infrastructure in place, and then we can kind of take it from there as new kinds of collection infrastructure are developed and rolled out, and really start to come more into the widely used, into wide use. And in urban areas, I think it could look like, there's starting to be more examples of buildings, like large buildings that do collection and processing, as part of the same building. There's a building out in Portland, Oregon, that it's a big office building, and the building produces a fertilizer that is sold out of the
Amazing.
building, which is very cool. That's like an output of the building is fertilizer. I mean, it's an output of the people in the building, but um, uh, I think that, and then it's a concentrated fertilizer, and I think concentration becomes important in this setting, especially in urban settings, because a lot of a lot of those nutrients are going to need to be transported to places where they're where there is a need for them, which is, potentially some of which could be on site or in an urban area, but where you have so many people, you're not growing you don't need all of that fertility from an urban area right within that urban area, probably. And so, concentration in order to facilitate, less energy use for transportation to move that out into places where that fertility is needed, I think will be an important piece of that puzzle. And there's a lot of companies working on concentration technologies. Rich Earth Institute has a spin-off company called Brightwater Tools that is working on this. There's a number of companies in Europe that are working on this as well, using different approaches, scientific approaches, all of which I think have a place, and I think could be useful in different contexts. And so I think it's good that there's different companies and entities working on different types of solutions.
Yeah, that's awesome. It actually sounds like it's further along than I was imagining. I was imagining this is like, some imagined future, and you're like, oh, actually, there's an office building in Portland, Oregon that's doing it, and
Yeah, and I think
it could happen.
it's still in the nascent stages. I think that there are a lot of examples of what it could look like, and I think that already exists, and I think that is really inspiring because it means that we have examples already of what it can look like. I think the key is kind of like replicating those and creating more of frameworks and community systems in order to kind of really start to make a dent. But yeah, totally.
I think one of the things we need to explore further, we're documenting all of these different models, and again, our colleague Julia has been working a lot on this in terms of sort of creating a directory of all of these models so people can look at and find out about them. But what we really need to explore further is sort of the economic models, how each of these models is working economically and also structurally in a way that, is fair, and is perceived as sort of fair and equitable to all the participants. It's not, some of the interesting questions get raised, like sometimes when we did those early interviews with some of our donors and in other interviews that I've done, some people have said, well, I'm not really sure if my urine is going to be collected and privatized and commoditized and sold somewhere and somebody's going to make a profit off of it. That doesn't seem fair to me. Some people have said that. I'm sure you could also think of a lot of things that we contribute to that we don't end up getting compensated for. But, so that one reason I was really intrigued by that CSA model was because it seemed like it was, it was really having an exchange, a reciprocal exchange where people were contributing to their urine, they're getting the food. It seemed like a good exchange. But
it also just seems like a almost a fun like implementation of like, oh yeah, I pick up my box of food and I bring my jug of urine, and
yeah.
You're part you're part of the process.
We've implemented that to some slight degree in the sense that we have a urine depot, as Arthur mentioned, in Brattleboro. We also have one in this town of Bellows Falls, Vermont, at the landfill there, or
at the transfer station.
Transfer station, sorry, wrong label. At the transfer station. So we built the depot right there at the transfer station. So when people come to, and there used to be a whole recycling center there at that transfer station. So it was kind of cool because you're thinking about bringing your urine to be recycled, at the recycling center. So there's some, aspect of that there. Anyway.
So just a few sort of et cetera questions. We've mentioned that urine is a high nitrogen fertilizer, but what is the NPK of human urine?
Yeah. So I'll pull it up right here.
I think it's 0.6 to 0.2 to, I can't remember the K. One.
Yeah, it's about Yeah, it's about I think it's about zero point 0.6, zero point 1, zero point 0.2. And so another way to say that is that in a gallon a gallon of urine, there's only about 0.05 pounds of nitrogen per gallon, which, I guess another way of saying that is that there's about in 20 gallons of pee, there's about 1 pound of nitrogen. So, and that's kind of like a lot of bandying around numbers. But as a typical wastewater product, it's very concentrated in terms of nutrients. But as kind of compared to most agricultural products that you'd buy, it's very dilute in terms of nitrogen. So that's kind of like it's in this like interesting zone where like you talk to wastewater people and it's super concentrated in terms of nutrients, and you talk to ag people and it's very dilute.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's in kind of an interesting place. But yeah, about 1 pound of nitrogen in approximately 20 gallons of pee.
Very interesting. And how does the nutrient composition of urine compare to feces?
That's
Good question. You want to take that one?
well, I don't actually know like the NPK offhand of human feces, but I do know that it's much higher in phosphorus and much lower in nitrogen. So
Interesting.
it'd be a more of a phosphorus source than a nitrogen source. Because most of the nitrogen in human waste is in the urine.
Got it.
Right.
But
So yeah, we think about so in the wastewater stream as a whole, we about 80% of the nitrogen that's in the wastewater stream is just from urine. So 20% of the nitrogen is from other sources, including feces. Probably I would imagine, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I would imagine that most of the remaining 20% is from feces, or at least a significant amount. And then about urine is still higher in phosphorus than feces because about 60 to 70% of the phosphorus in urine in wastewater is just from urine.
Yeah, interesting.
Maybe it's like 50 to 60% of the phosphorus in wastewater is from urine. So feces is definitely higher in phosphorus than it is in nitrogen, but urine still has more of both.
Fascinating. And while we're on the topic of phosphorus, how close do you think we are to peak phosphorus, and how much of an impact on the need for phosphorus for agriculture could we have with pea cycling?
yeah,
I
that's
have
a
no
good
idea how
question.
close we are.
I don't know how close we are to peak phosphorus. I was going to do some research on that before this meeting, but I didn't do it yet. But the issue with phosphorus is that, I'm sure you know, and your listeners probably know, but a lot of the phosphorus is mined, and there's a lot of environmental problems associated with the mining, and also there's a lot of difficulties getting to the phosphorus where it is. So, in other words, we could have quite a lot of phosphorus available, meaning we're not that close to peak phosphorus. But if you can consider how hard it is to get it, then maybe we're really close. Like a lot of it's in like Morocco, and a lot of it is in on the sea. What do you call it?
Continental shelf.
The shelf, yeah, the shelf. And so you'd
Yeah,
have to
at the
mine
bottom of
in
the
the
ocean.
ocean, exactly. And I know right now there's a lot of controversy around ocean mining. It's very disruptive to ocean life and stuff like that. So, from my perspective, the question really isn't how close are we to peak phosphorus, but how damaging is it to try to get that phosphorus, and how expensive and energy intensive it is as well to get
Excellent
that
Right.
point.
phosphorus from far,
And,
far
and
away.
I think,
Yeah.
also, I think, my perspective doing this work is we are producing phosphorus every day, and there's a lot of us. And
And we're just pissing it away.
we're just pissing it away. Exactly. And you know, it's not it will take some work to be able to effectively, get all of that stuff, all the phosphorus that we're pissing away. But But that's as long as there are people eating, we're going to be, we're going to be we're going to be, excreting phosphorus, and so that is a resource that we really should be tapping.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
that's one of the reasons that we did sort of expand from, we started, Rich Earth Institute started focusing on urine rather than both urine and feces, partly because it was just easier and more acceptable to people. Um, there's logical and valid sort of taboos associated with using your feces that makes sense because of the pathogens. But but we're aware that, again, those are nutrients that we're wasting, and we need to figure out a way. We need to figure out something to deal with it and to try to recover those nutrients. So yeah, so it just makes sense to try to figure that out. Oh, and we didn't mention, so one of the things we're doing in that study that we talked about is looking at the potential for using this pyrolysis process to create biochar from biosolids. And ideally, if that was done with source separated feces that had never gone and gotten combined with all the toxins at a waste treatment facility, that would be easier. But there is a lot of there seems to be potential with pyrolysis to remove a lot of the contaminants that are in feces. So
Oh, lovely.
yeah, yeah. So we're not, that study is looking at that. It's like how effective is it? What's the cost benefit analysis? That kind of thing.
Right.
Cool. Well, that also sounds like excellent work. Um, and it sounds like it hasn't maybe been published yet, but can you
No,
say
no, we're
anything?
just at the early phases of that
Yeah.
study.
What are the chances of removing PFAS from biosolids with pyrolysis?
Yeah, that's there's some studies that seem to indicate that it could eliminate the PFAS almost completely, but there hasn't been a huge number of such studies. So that's what we're actually investigating in this research. It's actually doing the pyrolysis and seeing how effective it is.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for
And
doing that good work. That's
there may be
going to be
other
important.
methods. And an interesting aspect about that too is that biochar that's created from the pyrolysis could potentially also be used as a filter to capture the contaminants. So that's a whole other aspect, that it could potentially be used as a filter in some way, because biochar has this capacity to hold on to various tablates and things. So,
Yeah. Awesome.
yeah.
What about the issue of salt in urine? Is that an issue for soil?
Well, it definitely is. There's definitely sodium in urine, especially if people have, if they eat a lot of salt, um, which I think generally we tend to eat a lot of salt across, as part of our diet. Um, the amount of salt is about it's similar to. Oh, it's not on this list. I'll take a look for it in a moment. But we have generally kind of uh, given the advice that if you live in a place where the amount of precipitation um, exceeds the amount of evaporation, then then it shouldn't be a big problem because it's going to generally just leach through the soil and not accumulate. I think for places that are arid, that could be a thing that should be like kind of given some thought to. And I think in more rainy places like New England, thinking about like greenhouse growing situations, I think it's worth thinking about, and making sure that you're inputting enough water. Um, do you
Yeah,
have
and
further thoughts on that?
we recently collaborated with the Land Institute out in Iowa, um, on a project where they are using urine to investigate the use of urine. They're particularly interested in the phosphorus on their alfalfa crops and other perennial crops they're growing. And so that they just wrote a paper that's going to be published in the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. And that paper talks about the sodium issue, because they did find an issue with sodium buildup more than they had, more than would be good for the crop. So they want to explore that further. So that's something that came up in that research, and they want to investigate it further. So
Interesting.
it's definitely worth considering in different climates, but there hasn't been, a huge amount of research on it so far.
Right. The amount of sodium historically in our urine testing has been about the same amount as the amount of potassium.
Oh, interesting.
I just put, and if in the chat, I just put that NPK thing.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I'll include that in the show notes so the listeners can find that easily.
But yeah, I think it's worth thinking about. But because because of the nature, I don't know, sodium with enough water, it tends to leach through. So
yeah, so it seems like most use cases not an issue, but if you're in more arid or in a greenhouse, then you should be more careful and
yeah,
take it into consideration.
yeah.
Can you apply urine to land in the winter?
You can. I wouldn't. I mean, I would say so. Again, just bringing it back to the fact that it's a readily available form for plant uptake.
Yeah.
And so, I think the best use of urine is applying it at a time when plants are like really ready to uptake it. I think that maybe I think there are ways that you could kind of get rid of it in terms of storage, potentially, maybe in some kind of composting situation where you're doing you have a high carbon compost and you're continuing to work on that through the winter. I think that that has some potential, but I wouldn't be kind of going out and pouring it on the snow or on a cold field.
Got it.
Right.
So if you need to ditch some of your urine supply, put it in the leaf compost pile, not directly applied to crop
Another
grounds.
potential thing you could do in depending on your climate could be applying it to a cover crop in the fall. I'm not sure the exact right timing for this. I was actually just talking with one of our board members at a recent retreat that we had about trying to figure out when would be the right timing. And actually, we're collaborating on another project where they're exploring the use of urine and cover crops in sort of an ecological nutrient management strategy. But it just seems to me that if you were planting a cover crop, say into your field right after you'd harvested your corn or something, there might be time to use the urine when that cover crop is growing, and that cover crop might then hold on to some of the nitrogen, and store it for you and turn it in the spring.
Cool. Well, I'm almost out of questions here, but a big one that has come up many times when I'm talking about Peecycling is what would you say is the number one way to reduce the ick factor? Because it seems like conceptually, most of the people I've talked to are like, yeah, that's a great idea. We should totally do that. But it's gross.
Okay. So the first
Oh,
thing
you
that
take it.
to say I'm sure Arthur will, you'll have comments also, but the first thing that I like to say when I get this question is, who is expressing the ick factor? So like you said, a lot of times in our interviews with people, we ask them how they feel about or what their concerns are. The first thing they say is pharmaceuticals. They don't say it's gross. They say pharmaceuticals. So, we did a whole bunch of interviews and we concluded that there really wasn't as much of an ick factor as people think. That when you talk to people about this and about the value of using urine, they don't really feel so grossed out by it. Again, that's different with feces, but it seems like with urine, once people understand that we're wasting these nutrients and we could be using them, they don't feel that way so much. And another thing is that as people start to do it, if they're a little, so instead of ick or gross, people might feel a little uncomfortable. I'm not saying nobody has an ick factor. Some people definitely do, and they feel like, oh, that is gross. But a lot of other people are more like, oh, a little uncomfortable about it at first. But when they start doing it, they become more comfortable over time. I mean, that's definitely something we've seen.
Excellent.
So I would say, the way to deal with it is to do exactly what we've been doing, which is talk to people about what's happening to our urine now, what's in it, how it might, how nutrients used to be used to fertilize crops and they're not anymore. There's a lot of also historical information that people have, even memories within their own family. Like they'll say, oh, my grandfather used to do that. Or, some people who come here, immigrants who come here from other countries will say, oh yeah, at home, everybody does that. They use urine in for their vegetables. So, there's different stories and we're trying to collect those stories to sort of, you could use the word normalize, to make it a more normal thing.
Excellent.
Because it's just become something that isn't normal and people then feel that they should feel uncomfortable about it. But as they learn more, they become more comfortable. That makes sense.
So education is key.
But Arthur, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my experience in this is talking to farmers and working with farmers, and um, I think one of the interesting things is we're so used to in our society using animal manure, animal excreta to grow plants. Farmers do this all the time. This is like bread and butter of how we grow food and how we've grown food for millennia. And so I think like putting it in that in that kind of context, I think is the thing that I've found to be helpful. And I think there are things that we have to do to make sure that it's a safe thing to do. But there's also things we do to other manures from other animals to make sure that it's a safe thing to do. And I think that I had another thought there. What was it? Anyway, yeah, I think that there are safety concerns, but we address those safety concerns just like we address those safety concerns with other kinds of manure. And
Also,
yeah,
another thing we found in those early interviews that we did was that, well, two things. One is that oftentimes people say, I like the idea. That sounds really
yeah.
interesting to me, but I'm sure my neighbor or I'm sure these other people are going to be grossed out by it. So
My uncle will definitely be grossed out about this.
we got that so often that we assigned what's called the coding category to it as we were evaluating everything. We called that ascribed attitudes, attitudes that you ascribe to somebody else. Because most of the people didn't have that attitude, but they thought someone else would have it. And,
Excellent point. Yeah.
so those other people, those presumed other people do need to be communicated with so that they understand whatever safety protocols are being used or whatever. The other thing I was going to say, no, I've forgotten the other thing I was going to say. Oh, that occupation. So the occupation that someone has that may also affect their attitude, because we often found that people who are more familiar or more, urine was in their life on a more regular basis, such as nurses and anybody in the health profession or mothers, parents who are just around urine a lot, were more comfortable with it. They didn't have as much of that distance. that people have been able to create. So Arthur's a new recent parent, so you're probably very comfortable with
Well, I do a lot. I mean, I already was, but
you already were comfortable, but you get that that thing about parents.
it's continued.
It's continued.
But yeah, and I think that the no, I keep losing my thoughts about this topic, but um,
But in addition to farmers, like you were saying, farmers don't have that attitude because to them it just makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
We really don't have. I don't think I've ever talked to a farmer. Their main concern is how will my customers feel, and then there's a discussion about what
yeah,
information would their customers need, or how transparent would they be in communicating to their customers. Because as many farmers have said, well, I don't tell my customers about my other fertilizers that I use, and they don't ask me about them. But if
yeah,
they did ask me, I would tell them. You
right.
know,
I mean, I
that
think the other thing is like communicating that, like, I think one of the things, well, there's two, so there's two thoughts. One, kind of on that note, the difference between biosolids and urine. I think the great thing about biosolids, in theory, is that it is recycling human waste for use in agriculture. I think that the downside of biosolids, as we have seen, and I mean, I think as you all in Maine have seen, in some ways more than anyone else, is the issues with contamination and the fact that biosolids are coming from a treatment system where everything has gone, not just human waste, but all of the other wastes that go down your sink that come from industry, that come from various sources. Whereas I think what we're talking about is either like source separated urine or source separated urine and feces, even potentially, that hasn't gotten mixed with all this other stuff. And then, at least from my perspective, I think that makes it a much cleaner product and, much more, a lot more predictable in terms of what might be in there.
Yeah, there's
And
a lot less to go wrong.
a lot less to go wrong because you're just starting with a smaller denominator of stuff. And I think that, we haven't mixed it. Whenever you mix stuff, it's hard to get stuff out without getting other stuff out.
you're right.
And I think that, and on the other hand, just about the ick factor, I think the other thing is just making sure that collection is a process that doesn't kind of increase ick for people. I think that making sure that toilets that are installed are going to function well and aren't going to kind of create an unnecessary ick factor for people who are kind of just trying to go to the bathroom.
Another thing that just occurred to me as you were speaking, Arthur, about why it's not good to mix the feces with everything else. The same thing is kind of true about food scraps and food waste that, like in Vermont, I don't know what the situation in Maine, but in Vermont, they passed a law to keep food waste out of landfills, because of the methane production and all of that. But it just makes sense too to keep it out of the landfill and use it instead before it gets mixed with everything else,
Yeah.
and waste it in that way. If you keep the food waste out of the landfill and mix it into your compost, then you can use it, and it's a cleaner source. It's kind of a similar thing.
Excellent. Well, I think that's about our time, and I really appreciate all the huge amount of insight you've been able to bring to this topic. I couldn't ask for better guests. And if people want to follow the work of the Rich Earth Institute, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. Well, we have a website, and the has lots of info on there. We also have a quarterly newsletter that you can sign up for on the website. That we send out updates about what we're up to every 3 months. So that's hopefully not a huge addition to your inboxes if you're interested. And then there's the various guides that we talked about, the home use guide, the farmer guide. We also have a kind of community scale guide that kind of describes our community skill system. And then the other big thing is our annual summit, which happens in November. So a little bit most of the year to go until that happens again. But that is an event that brings together people who are working on this issue from all over the world, and it's accessible in a hybrid form, either in person or online. So if people are interested in attending and hearing some of the research and implementation projects from all over the world, that's a great resource as well.
Excellent.
I also just want to put another plug in for our community science survey.
Oh, yeah.
That's on the that's also accessible on the website, and that's where people can. We have a data sheet, even if people want to do it in a more. If people are, interested in experimenting in their garden, they can do it in a more precise format where they can fill out the data sheet about how much urine they're using and what observations they're seeing with their crops, and then. Also, just for general questions, you can always write to us at info@richearthinstitute.org.
Excellent. And I will link all those things in the show notes. And thanks again for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions, and I really appreciated your kind of questions you were asking. It was great.
I didn't get any listener submitted audio for this segment again, so probably going to wrap up this experiment pretty soon. And for this time, I think I'll leave you with a song.
I swear that someday I'll tell you without lying, I was born to quit smoking, I was born to quit dying. On that day, not doing heroin will be easy as pissing. On that day, I'll stop talking so much shit about the government, 'cause urine speaks louder than words on a politician or on a prison warden. Urine speaks louder than words. I swear that today I was born to be living, I was born to be singing, I was born to be fighting. But will somebody say, is this resistance or a costume party? Either way, I think black with bandanas is a boring theme. I don't gotta tell ya, crackers are great with amnesia when they wanna forget something like centuries of racism. Say, look at the man on center stage and pay no attention while millions get locked in a cage. Riots break out in Oakland. The urine speaks louder than words on a prison warden or on a BART policeman. Urine speaks louder than words.